Welcome everyone. I'm Melissa Healy, one of the directors here, if I haven't met you before. Thank you very much for coming out on a cold Canberra night, and thank you for joining us online, much appreciated. I'm going to hand you over to Bob, who's going to do the formal introductions, but enjoy, please help yourself to nibbles. In terms of emergency stuff, the bathrooms and obviously the lifts are out there if there's any dramas, but hopefully we'll all be quiet, so that should be okay.
Yeah,
Bob,
sure.
I'll hand over to you to do formals.
My name is Bob Cheng. I'm the financial advisor. I think about wealth need to cover property and shares and everything else, business. It's not just in portfolios. And if you look at the richest people in the world, they own property. So definitely it's a wealth creation tool. We're very privileged to have 1Group to come here. And so Julian come from Melbourne, flew in, and we've got Michael flew in from Sydney. When I was working in Sydney, 1Group is the most regarded property advisors nationally now. I think we have a footprint in Queensland, in Melbourne, in Sydney. Our relationship with 1Group, it's not conflicted. We don't get anything from them, nothing, not even your coffee. But what we do is we're here to educate. We're here to make you think. We're here to share ideas. So everything's about strategy. There's no product, nothing for sale other than ideas. So I'm going to hand over to Julian, and also we have Tao Yelos to join us from Sydney.
You do. Yeah, Tel's online and I'm here in person, as you can see. So good evening and good evening, everyone. I've got Michael clearly, if you want to put your hand on there, Michael. He's coming along to join us this evening too. Yeah, the purpose of tonight, and credit to Bob and Melissa for organising this, is it's all education and insights. It's about us. We're active in the property market, negotiating and competing on a daily basis. And when you look at the different, I guess, areas you can take advice or get insight on the property market, you tend to have your valuation firms, and they're naturally looking at lag indicators because property valuations come through after purchases, and they can see the trends of property valuations, so they can pinpoint rising markets and declining markets based on transactions that have already happened. You have then some other firms that will speculate and look at what they think are lead indicators, and sometimes none of them are actually out there competing and trying to buy property themselves. So naturally, where we have a bit of an edge on the market is we've got the internal valuation expertise. We're looking at the key infrastructure investment and lead indicators around population change, demographics and immigration, but then we're also backing up because we're going out there and securing properties as well. So we secure residential properties, commercial properties, and we also work a lot in the owner-occupied space too. So businesses that come to us and say, hey, we're expanding, we're growing, we want multiple sites, we need to move our team from having 2,000 square metres in the CBD to having 1,000 square metres, we want fringe office, all that location strategy and site acquisition work we do as well. So we feel we've got a pretty good lens on the market, and just as Bob said, there's nothing else to sell here tonight other than to give some insight and hopefully some strategic direction as well. Because it is a time in the market where there's a lot of change happening. Where for us as a buying business, that's great. We love it because if you look at 6 to 8 months ago, I think strategy somewhat went out the window a little bit because you could just buy anything anywhere and everything was rising at once. So a lot of people saw hands from patting themselves on the back, making a lot of money on the property market without too much due diligence. And if you paid too much and the property was a bit average, well, it didn't matter. There'd be a valuation 3 weeks later at 10% higher. But we seem to be coming out the other side of that. It's very much a shifting landscape now, and something that we're hoping we can make sense of tonight. So, bit of a hybrid one, so I'll be navigating keyboard, talking to you, and then also talking to the camera. But you please ask questions as we go, because yeah, it's very informal in that sense. If you've got specific questions to Canberra, I might not be the best person for you. We are Eastern Seaboard, so we secure sites nationally, and we do acquire sites in Canberra through the Sydney office, and then one of our team members, Adam, who's based in Queensland, is from Canberra. She moved here about 10 years ago. So we've got knowledge on the marketplace here, and it's a smaller market where we find most people in these environments tend to have a pretty good handle on the local market, and they're generally not coming in here to hear from us about what we think about Canberra. They're coming in here to see how they can potentially expand their portfolios into other investment assets, like maybe commercially if they haven't done it before, or even looking at other markets like Melbourne, Sydney, or Brisbane. The way we're going to present is mainly through case studies. So talking through acquisitions that we've done recently or sites that we've bought and why we bought them. I feel that's just an easier way to hopefully give some guidance. And then you've got some visuals then of what you might be looking for if you want to embark on a similar strategy. So we'll keep it quite macro to start with, what's impacting on the property market and influencing it. And then we'll go into Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, have a look at challenges, opportunities, and then residential. Naturally, everything we talk about is very general in nature, so everyone's situation is very different. And we're really big on this. Both Tal and I come from a financial planning background, and our view on direct property investment is it's done poorly generally from a company perspective and from the investment group approach. It's an unregulated space. So if you are, for example, partnering with a developer to sell off the plan units or house and land packages, in most cases, you don't even have to have a real estate license, and you also don't need to disclose your work. So you do have these businesses out there that have a process that's geared towards client best interest in the way that they talk to you. They might even talk around things like investment strategies and superannuation and retirement age and all these things that look like they've got maybe credentials, skills, and your best interests at heart, but it's actually a buyer beware environment. So some of these groups would give advice to clients, said loosely, to buy multiple properties very quickly, which can be really high risk, and it actually falls back onto the purchaser to make sure it's the right move for them. Whereas if you came to Bob and you filled out your forms, you were low risk, and he put you in high risk stuff, you probably heavily regulated space. They're very different. So in this space, you just got to be very mindful what you're dealing with. So from our point of view, it's all fee-for-service work that we do. It's all very strategy-led, client-first. So we don't have any listings, we don't market any projects, we don't touch off property, we never take a commission or a kickback. And like I said before, we don't pay them, we don't receive them. And it keeps us really independent in the process. So when we're talking to clients about that $900,000 price point, it's just not quite meeting the market at the moment. We think you should push up to 1.2 to 1.4 because there's better opportunities. Our fees don't change. And by the same token, when we say, look, we think you should look at a buy and renovate strategy because there's just a real gap in the market between unrenovated and renovated properties. Once again, it's advice that's in your best interest. So internally, we've got our own research team and pricing team and our buyer's agent team, which Michael's one of our guns in that regard. And they're out there executing the brief. And then from a strategy point of view, it's part buyer's agent, part research, part director-led. From a pricing point of view, for example, even though we've got that in-house valuation expertise, they work hand in hand with the buyer's agents to come up with the value of the property. Because the buyer's agent might have inspected, even competed on a few of the properties we're using, whereas the value is in the back end. They're just going in after the fact and saying, yeah, similar land, similar style, similar bedrooms. There's obviously risk in that. Whereas we might have Michael say, no, I went to that auction. There was 3 bidders, a neighbour bought it at a silly price. There was a lot of ego in that price. Don't count that one. Let's use these 3 sales. So it's really strategic in that sense. We think pricing is an area we're careful on. I think in this market where it's a real shifting landscape, it's probably more critical than ever. And then we have external consultants and providers that we work with as well. They're always independent of us, and once again, we engage purely for their expertise and advice. So property acquisition is a real project. And that's the way we position it with our clients. And we actually use a project management platform when we take on a brief, purely for that reason. There's lots of key people in different parties. We might be talking strategy. Bob and I were having a good chat earlier about buying commercial property and putting down cash versus putting cash into trust and getting a return on that investment. How would it affect the yield? And that's the discussions that we love. Because really, everyone needs to stay in their lane when you're doing property investment. You need advice from so many different parties. And if you have someone that's giving quasi-legal advice, but they're really a property advisor, there's risk in that. By the same token, if you haven't got your key people around the table when you're making a decision on the strategy, not so much the site selection, that'd be more a property advisor or you, really need to have that collaboration with your team. It just de-risks the process. A lot of this stuff is very hard to unwind retrospectively from ownership structure or their real property style. And I think that's where the strategy piece is, where a lot of people may come home to roost over the next 24 months, especially as interest rates rise, yields naturally significantly lower than where they were a couple of years ago. Values have gone up, rents have stayed the same almost everywhere except probably smaller cities like Adelaide, Canberra and Brisbane. Melbourne, Sydney, rents have stayed about the same and the market's grown 20% in some cases. So if you bought at that peak point and rates go up, there's going to be a pretty big disparity between the rent and what you're putting out there every month. The other area that we do see some risk is really around these kind of house and land areas. because a lot of times the developers were ramping up the prices of land, the build costs were going up, and people were buying these really big price points, what we consider to be big compared to the more established market in the regions. And what can happen is there could be some valuation risk for those people that have bought and they've got a future settlement date when you get into these markets. So off the plan can work well for some buyers that put pen to paper on the contract at the start of this cycle 2 years ago, and then they've settled and it's gone up. And then they can kind of get that sense that that's why you buy it, because the market's always rising. But there's obviously a lot of risk there as well. And the price you pay is absolutely critical in that sense. So investment principles is always the best place to start. As much as it might seem like, well, it's just lots of words on paper, really what underpins our decision-making framework. And this is where I think if you are looking to work with anyone, I'd say probably across all sectors of professional services, and ourselves in that bucket as well, it's really understanding what do they believe about investment? What do they believe is smart investment, safe investment, quality investment? And this is where you really want to be aligned. And for us, it's really around not trying to overcomplicate. I think we all know that the fundamentals of property are pretty easy to get your head around. Where it becomes challenging is then balancing affordability, cash flow, timing, when to take action. It's the judgment pieces that become really good. That property or that property. And do I do it now or do I do it in 6 months? How's it going to impact everything else we want to do in our life? Upgrading the home or buying a lifestyle property. That's where it gets really complex. And that's where your team comes in to guide you on that stuff. We often say to clients, no one really sits in front of us and says, $1 million, high growth, residential property, I'll just buy anything, I just want something. You say, well, that's great. And when you start to break down the areas and regions, then the opinions come in. Oh, we actually don't like that. We love a house that looks like this. Great if we could buy something we could use later in life. And that's where property gets really complex. As a pure investment decision, it's pretty simple. And if you're investing for the long term, you're either getting in late on this cycle or you're getting in early on the next cycle. It shouldn't matter as long as it's affordable. And as long as it's quality. And we really always come back to that quality. We do a lot of portfolio reviews, which are great for us because there's a lot of learnings and research that we get around. So that might be where a client comes to us and says, I've got these 3 or 4 properties. I included them, I acquired them pretty ad hoc over the last 15 years. I don't know whether they're the right properties. I should sell them more. We want to upgrade the home and they've told us we don't have the debt capacity to do that. So we need to work out whether we offload some assets. We get a lot of, we do a lot of work around reviewing the portfolio, what they should keep, what they should sell. And it always comes back to this conversation. You'd rather have a couple of really A-grade properties than have 5 or 6 or 10 properties. Good barbecue banter to have 10 properties. And this is probably the other area, this macro and micro research. Like it's great to look at key projects and infrastructure investment and population growth. But a lot of times we can get a little bit starry-eyed by the positives. A new train station going in, gentrifying area. But then you've got to get down to the gritty of the quality of the home, the structure, the orientation, the busyness of the street, the walking distance to primary schools, things like that. And that's where it becomes challenging because you're trying to combine the macro to micro and also your personal situation. And this is probably the big one for everyone at the moment. I think there's time in the market, not timing the market. Naturally, we all want to time the market. And I think property is somewhat, a lot of people are looking at it as you can have quick wins because other people you talk to have had quick wins. They time things really well. And we had some, if we take ourselves back to the start of 2020, somewhat overwhelming time for me. I was actually having my first baby, which I was just telling Gordon about before. So I was a bit distracted. I didn't even know that COVID was around until probably June in 2020. I was in the trenches trying to raise a little human for the first time. But it was scary times. And we had a significant portion of our clients ring us and say, look, we're just going to sit on the sidelines. We said, yeah, we respect your decision. We've got no idea where the property market's going. No one did. Then there was another wave of clients that started inquiring to us about saying, hey, we see opportunity. And we see that now might be a really good time. Totally different profile of thinker. And we're even seeing that now. The investors that are coming through and wanting to take action, it's either a great time for them, professionally, personally. They've had a cash event or they've been wanting to do something for a long time. And they're not too concerned about the outside noise because they know the right plan, they can invest well. Or they see that there's going to be opportunity, prices are different. Really selective on what you buy and what you pay, you can do. And the hard thing with that is the really well good enough or could you do better by waiting? That's always the challenging question. I should put a caveat there that we don't have the answer to that. It's a personal choice. The last thing any decent advisor in any sector will do is tell you that they know what you should do something. It's a great way to lose a relationship. You win the relationship for life and all the people you get it right for, and you lose all the other. You're better off leaving that up to them. So we bring insight, we bring education, and we leave those big decisions of when you do it up to you. And that's where they want to think. So we'll touch on some different strategies tonight, and this one here you probably can't see there is cash flow. So growth, cash flow, renovations, commercial property projects, all the areas that we cover. And just talking through risk considerations and different case studies around. So a lot of these principles are transferable. So even though the case studies aren't local to you, what you can take from them is different angles on how you can approach the property market and how we think as a business should do this full time as an investment firm. So, and there's different risk profiles that fit in with each of these as well, different risk considerations. So what does a strategy mean? Because I think it's a loose word sometimes. People say you've got to get the strategy right. I think, what is the strategy? Is that houses versus units? Is it cash flow versus growth? Is it Brisbane versus Melbourne? Is it now or later? Is it buy and hold, buy, renovate, flip? All of that stuff comes into play. And it's really all of it. It's long-term goals, risk profile, what kind of exposure you want to have, what kind of LVR you want to have, what kind of cash flow you're looking for, negative gearing, positive gearing. There's so much that goes on with this. And I think most people don't really consider it. Most people just say, I want to buy property. Everyone's doing property. Let's go buy property. And then they work out whether it works based on the performance of the property. But naturally, if you go into a period in the market where the market's not doing anything and you haven't got a strategy, a plan, you just question yourself the whole time. And the best investment's the one that allows you to sleep at night, which is not our quote. I think it was Warren Buffett that said that. And that's the truth. Last thing you want to do is stress about something and wonder whether you made the right decision. If you've got a clear game plan, you execute the game plan. You don't stress about it because you know you bought the right strategy. So getting this piece right, and this is part accounting, financial planning, property advisory, part research. And we talk to this around case studies as well, because it'd be too hard to say, would you want to embark on a growth strategy, capital growth? So what does that look like? What does the house look like? What does the area look like? What kind of cash flow contribution? Do I need to renovate it? How long do I need to hold it for? There's lots of real key questions here to answer. The market research piece is probably the easier part because it's stagnant. You can sit in the office for 12 to 15 hours and you can research the hell out of the area pretty comfortably. It's a moving beast, but not too significant. Gentrification, population change, major projects, they happen over a period of time. They don't happen overnight. So there's a few things that might do really big, it might be really big influences in the property market, but generally this stuff is stuff that can be learned. It's the combining of one and two that becomes really challenging. And probably the most difficult is the execution piece. And this is when you're out there competing in the property market. This is when you're managing your emotions, managing your expectations. I was chatting to a client just recently who used us on residential, didn't use us on a commercial property. He was buying with business partners and they wanted to do it on their own. And they paid $4 million for a site that's probably worth about 3.6 and maybe even a little bit less. He said he felt sick. He said, I felt like we went a bit hard on this. He said, we were just all so stretched with having these late meetings, going through the properties that we wanted to buy, and going through the fit-out consulting and doing the plans and the town planning advice. And so he essentially spent probably in excess of 400 grand of what he should have, purely because they were just worn out. And I think it happens a lot. Yeah, you see in the residential market all the time, like I say this too. You know, people spend money on a building inspection, so they say, well, we're happy to go a bit harder on this because we're building inspection. You've got to pull all that stuff back in context again and say, well, you should just be factoring in a minimum of 3 or 4 of those when you're going through the process. So this is where you're sourcing off markets, pre-markets. This is when you're trying to combine 1, 2, and 3 all together in what is a competitive landscape, fast-paced landscape, where you're getting a call to say, look, we want offers by 4 million for selling. You know, in a market like Brisbane, they don't disclose the other offers. They just say we've got an acceptable price. You don't know what the acceptable price is. It might be 100 grand under yours. Really challenging. And that's where having some agent relationship and a bit of intel can be really helpful, just to be able to say where we need to be. Obviously, we never know for sure. Once again, it's all part of it. So for us, this is how we view strategy. So I'd love to sit here and say to you that all you need to do is get the plan right, download the Heron Todd White property clock, buy when it's at the bottom, sell when it's at the top, You can retire early. That'd be great. Essentially what these are is they're pulling in data from their valuations and looking at where they see the market rising based on values within a certain region. But you can also see that it'd be very hard to say Perth's rising, same way you'd say Canberra's rising, what areas, and all to different levels. Right? So you're really getting a big lumpy piece of information that's not that helpful. But it's great to put into a diagram because it helps people to say, well, okay, so the whole market's rising at the moment. There's nothing heading into decline here. But this was put out just before rates went up. And now all of a sudden, everything's apparently quickly flipped to here. Right, so this is where it gets really tricky. You might pick up the clock. Okay, this is terrific. I'm just going to go and buy one of these places. What's the cheapest? And you've still got all the subcategories, property styles, locations, school catchments, all the granular stuff that comes into play. See your camera for those that are interested. I think it's been there for a while though. That's the other thing. They do highlight the markets that are in a new place. They're the yellow ones, but they don't highlight how long those other markets have been sitting there. They get it wrong a lot, but it's interesting to take note of. So this is apartments. The last one was houses. So the question we often get when we're here in Canberra is, what do you think about the apartment? It's interesting when you see that almost every apartment market in the country is rising except for Canberra, which from our research is just a supply issue. Now, once again, there'll be anomalies here. There'll be great buildings, great developments that have performed really well. There'll be areas that don't have oversupply where people love apartment. There's always anomalies with this stuff. Okay? It's the same when you look at the data on apartment growth. Sydney is really the only market in the country where you can make money similar to house growth on your investment. The Sydney apartment market really, on the eastern side, would you say, Michael, heading east, is where it's ferocious. One bed for $1 million, two beds for $2 million. Unbelievable numbers. You wonder where the money comes from. So this is fascinating to know. And the reason being, supply and demand is difficult to manage with units. If I buy a house in a middle ring suburb, I know the next year there's either going to be the same or less houses. It's either going to be the same because there's no land, or less because they're knocking them over and building townhouses. If I buy a townhouse, well, there's a greater chance there'll be more next year, and if there's units, there's a higher chance of it. So it's simple supply and demand fundamentals, which doesn't mean they won't grow, but it does mean there's a lesser chance that there's going to be price pressure on those types of things. And look, there's caveats on that too, in a sense that some people want them for security, they're downsizing, they've made their money through other investment strategies. They don't need to optimize and squeeze the lemon on every cent, and they just want to leave. That's fine. So this is purely from the investment. Just checking to make sure we've still got our online crew. They haven't sacked us yet. Oh, it's growing. Must be doing a good job. That's good. So on the residential side, what we looked at when we were really trying to summarise these markets is they're all in a pretty similar state of play. A lot more off-market, pre-market transactions coming through. Clients sit in front of us when the market's booming and say, can you source us off-market properties? They're fearful because stock levels are low. What we honestly say is probably 1 in 5 are decent off-market properties. Very few in a booming market. Because why would you sell off-market? You go to market, list it and see where it lands. But what's happening now is there's a lot of vendors who want to capture the current state of the market. And they're saying, we want to sell. Find someone we'll sell. And agents are also, their commissions are dropping. Coming off boom years, you probably notice they're all driving new cars. Now this is what's happened now. It's a great time to be negotiating. But the caveat to that is, well, is it going to get better? Right? And I keep putting that out there because we naturally, not trying to pick that now is a perfect moment, but there is some fundamentals out there that are showing us that this uncertainty over the next 6 to 12 months is going to create opportunity. There's been plenty of times where the property market's dipped down to 10%, I think 3 or maybe 4 times in the last 7 years, and then it's bounced back really quickly inside of that because people see the dip in prices and see opportunity and they launch into it. But every time it's done, it's for different reasons. Okay. You've got CBA saying they think at the back end of next year we might get some rate drops. So it could surge over the next 12 and then start to get some rate drops next year depending on what happens with inflation. And once again, that would encourage people to get back in the market. So these times of uncertainty can be when the best opportunities are in, but not every property. We're still competing on properties that we're getting absolutely slammed on sometimes. We think it's going to sell at a level, it sells 20% higher. Wow, that was like last year. So there's still opportunities out there that we're missing. But there's definitely prices we're achieving that we're somewhat surprised by in some cases as well. But the only way you know is if you're out there targeting properties. There isn't a red light that goes off and says now's the time to buy. So across all markets, this is what we're seeing. It's off-market activity, prices are holding and not exceeding. Because we do a bandwidth, we value a property, we say, well, it's going to sell between 9 and 9. So we're getting it right. Sometimes we might get 870, 890, we're picking them up at 900. Every now and then we're competing at the top of the bandwidth, but not always. Markets like Brisbane and Sydney, harder than Melbourne. Melbourne, you have a statement of information which gives you information on 3 comparable properties. They're never accurate, but it gives you some ballpark figures, which is a better system, I think. And this unrenovated out of favour is purely based on the fact that trades are stretched, prices are increasing and hard to get a handle on, and we're just seeing that unrenovated properties are out of favour, especially if they're unlivable. If they're somewhat rentable, they're a great opportunity if you can just cosmetically clean them up a bit in the market and lease them for a while. No significant works. So if you've got trade contacts, you've got resources in that area, it's a great strategy, right? There's a real difference between renovated and unrenovated. When the market's ramping like last year, we look at an unrenovated house and think that needs 200 grand work, and it's sold for nearly the same amount as that one. And once again, it happens everywhere. People just start to value everything the same. Same with slightly busier streets or slightly inferior spots. Everything gets priced around the same. As the market slows, that's when the gaps start to open. And the affordability constraints things, it's big. And a lot of what's pushing the population to smaller cities and to regional centres is that affordability aspect. The lifestyle can be significantly better. The access to services, education, amenities by moving to a regional centre versus being out in the outer corridors in some of our major cities. And I'll talk a bit around what's happening in Victoria there, because I think that's where the biggest opportunity is for low price point investment as a business, and not just my opinion, is some of these Ballarat and Bendigo regional centres, which are really thriving. And that's where you've got some lower price point investment where you still get good yields. You can still buy really well-positioned houses for 600,000 to 700,000 that have got a 3.5% yield on them, which is rates rise is more important for investors. And the long-term forecasts are for them to be really robust towns. A lot of investment there. And I think that falls obvious, right? Naturally, what happens is investors really pull back when there's uncertainty in the market. What's happening is there's a lot of stimulus for first-time buyers, a lot of support coming through from government, both state and federal. So from that aspect, they tend to fulfil the void of the first time of the investor, because they tend to be sub 800K in most cases, depending on the market, and looking for similar styles of property. On the commercial side, it's really mixed. And the commercial market is really hard to sum up in a slide, but it's also not going to be relevant for everyone. And I guess just to touch on it from a fundamentals point of view, I mean, commercial property investment sub 5 mil, so that 1 to 5 mil range was really, really popular in the last couple of years. So I guess you're looking at it from a safety house perspective. A lot of investors and SMSF investors and people that have capacity for 1 to 2 mil are saying, let's buy a small commercial property, and even though it's only going to give us 4% yield, we feel comfortable with owning a tangible asset with some income. And then all of a sudden, more buyers, the cap rate, they started going lower and lower, and then owner-occupiers started saying, hey, we're seeing all this money, business is great, let's buy commercial property. And all of a sudden, vacant properties were selling more for tenanted properties than tenanted properties. We're starting to go, wow, this is out of whack. We look at industrial properties that have got no income, selling for more than the ones that have income. So then all of a sudden, the business owners were saying, we need space, we need to grow. Why would we want to be a tenant? We've got all this money in the bank. It's been a really fascinating time in the commercial landscape. So everything down at the lower end to the bigger stuff. And a lot of the suburban retail strips started converting into services. We talked to dental groups who had CBD office and suburb office. They say we're losing patients in the city, we're gaining them in the suburbs at levels we can't keep up with, which is really interesting. And a lot of the suburban high streets don't have sufficient property. So we saw growth in the suburbs and naturally huge issues in the cities. But in the cities, you've mainly got funds and family offices, and you've got extreme wealth. They're not as impacted as the suburbs. So we haven't seen the hurt there. a lot of these big buildings, this was Flight Centre's building on St Kilda Road, they're sold to these big investment groups, they're refurbing them and trying to pull businesses in there doing phenomenal incentives, 50% incentives, basically means they're reducing their overheads by 50% for the first term of their lease. So really interesting time in the commercial game, but not relevant for everyone, so I won't go too deep on it. Essential services assets are what a lot of investors are chasing: childcare centres, medical centres, government tenants, that type of stuff. So this is probably what scared us the most, other than getting sick when COVID hit. We were looking at population and thought, wow, the population's not growing, especially being from Melbourne. Saying, what's going to happen to the property market? And this is, we did some work with Mark McCrindle, who's a demographer, and they did some forecasting on net overseas migration. So basically, we're going into the negative. We think it's going to take a few years to get back into pre-COVID levels. So this was their forecast here, which is 2025. And they've actually been spot on if it happens, because most of the banks have come out and said a similar thing. It's really fascinating to think that the rental markets and the property markets have been growing. We haven't been growing in population. When you look at places like Melbourne, we've been significantly negative compared to where we usually are. And Melbourne got hit double because we had all this boom in these regional centres. And I'll touch on it a little bit later, but we're the most dense capital city in the country. 76% of the population in Victoria lives in the city, whereas Sydney's 65 and Brisbane's 40. So it kind of had to happen as well. You know, Plan Melbourne's strategy is to decentralise it, but it wasn't to decentralise it so much. You know, we're looking at. So as this comes back, it's going to add an interesting dynamic to the marketplace because rents are rising, and we haven't got the population pressure. So it's going to bring an interesting dynamic, which no one has an answer on, but it's going to be fascinating to see. This is what I touched on before. So Sydney, generally, because of affordability, naturally they have a loss of local population purely because people move centres around or to Queensland. And they're not always moving to Brisbane. And that's where the data on Southeast Queensland is interesting, because even though you're seeing it at a really phenomenal level at the moment, it's not all putting pressure on Brisbane. And Brisbane's been that property market that's been tip to boom for 10 years. The last time Brisbane really cranked was back in the early 2000s, when it nearly doubled in about 3 years. Not just Brisbane, but Southeast Queensland. And it seems to be on a pretty similar path at the moment. With Sydney, I'm going to pass over to Tel. So we're going to go from in-person to virtual now. And Tel's going to give you some insights on the Sydney property market. Tel, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. How's coming through okay on that end?
Yep. Coming through perfect. We can't see you, which is a bit disappointing, but that's all right.
That's okay. Could be a positive. Okay. Look, following on from what Julian said, we're sort of digging now into the capital cities, and I think it's important to understand on a macro level what the plan of each city is. And Sydney's, I guess, plan is fairly unique amongst the capital cities in that there is a three-city strategy, so to speak. There's the harbour city, which is the traditional city that sort of goes from the city up to the northern beaches and down to the Sutherland Shire. And then you've got what we term to be the river city or Greater Parramatta, so to speak, which is the red area there on the slide. And that extends out to one of the biggest growth hubs in Sydney, being the northwest. And then the newest city, which has received a lot of media attention of late, which will be centred around the second major airport, what will be Sydney's largest airport out at Badgerys Creek. And that'll extend to the north around Penrith, which will be a light city, already is to an extent, and down south towards Campbelltown, Macarthur. So the idea where a lot of capital cities sort of having these node strategies or these activity centre strategies, Sydney's a little bit different in that they're having three major centres overall. In terms of what we're seeing in the market over there, there's definitely been a slowdown of growth. I think we registered 0.1% growth in houses, negative 0.3% in units over the last month. So we've absolutely stagnated. But as Julian referred to earlier on, there are still markets within markets. There are still sectors and properties that we're seeing that are, that we're expecting to win on the ground, and we're getting blown out of the water. So the importance of buying the right type of asset in these certain times are really important. The auction clearance rate, surprisingly, is still holding up pretty well in the mid 60s. And the demand from buyers is still there. However, what we're seeing is they're taking longer to transact. And because they're taking longer to transact, it means that there's a stockpile of property stock on the market, and that can then further contribute to the softening of the market in Sydney and probably in the other capital cities as well. Julian mentioned that Sydney was one of the premier markets for apartment living, and that's largely due to affordability. If you want to live anywhere between sort of 10 or 15 kilometres from Sydney CBD and you've got a budget under $1 million, you're going to be in an apartment. There's not really much choice outside of that. But what we're seeing is that whilst apartments are performing really well in those inner ring and to an extent in the middle ring, when you start going into, if you like, the red and the yellow areas on that map, or the river city and the parkland city, the performance has been quite dismal. And the performance, probably over a long period of time has not been there, because the disparity between apartment prices and housing prices is just not there to fuel the growth of apartments and the demand for apartments. Currently I've got a client on board that we're looking after that purchased a property out in Campbelltown, which is sort of in the southwest there. And they probably bought the best apartment in that whole building, a dual level with a rooftop terrace, and a beautiful apartment out there. And they paid about $610,000 for it 8 years ago. Bearing in mind that Sydney's probably experienced 2 to 3 booms in that time, and that property is now worth less than what she bought it for, in a market that's probably experienced one of the strongest growth over the last 10 years. So whilst apartments do perform well in Sydney, again, they've got to be in the right areas, and we're seeing those outer ring apartments being decimated at the moment because the demand is not there. There are various schemes, and there's been a bit of media around the New South Wales budget in particular, around the shared equity schemes and deferred stamp duty method, and being able to replace an upfront stamp duty with a land tax type of arrangement, generally geared towards the sub $1 million mark. I think some of the limits on those around the $950,000 mark. I think what that's going to translate to potentially is that could assist certain properties in retaining value in areas that are traditionally mortgage belts. Again, they are still proposed and not enacted, and it could be a while before they come into play, and they may not form part of what happens over the next couple of years. In terms of new homes, high-rise apartments, off-the-plan apartments, these sorts of properties, we view those to be the highest risk in this type of market, particularly in Sydney, particularly in the outer suburbs. When you look at the 3-city strategy and the dotted lines there, they're generally the arterial roads that cross over Sydney, and there's a whole bunch of motorways that are there already, and a lot that are being built at the moment. And we see, some of those roads that I guess cross over those 3 cities being the corridors of most opportunity from a property acquisition point of view, and based on pure investment fundamentals. Go to the next page. We'll just jump into a little bit of a case study. So for us, a lot of the things that we look at with clients is around trying to not only rely on market drivers and growth drivers associated with an area, but looking at the intrinsic value of the land, and ultimately looking at properties that may possess the ability to be improved, developed, or otherwise. Now, in a lot of cases, our clients that maybe purchase these types of properties will probably never go on to build or develop or renovate or anything else. It's just the fact that there is that ability and there is that option with the property that allows them to take advantage of the growth that will generally outperform the market. This is a property that we purchased in early 2020, and it was really around the time that sort of COVID kicked in. So probably an opportune time. And I think Julian mentioned before that there's different types of investors. There's the ones that come out of the woodwork when there's a bit of uncertainty, I know that a lot of my long-term clients call me around this time, and been receiving several calls over the last couple of weeks where they say, don't forget me, I'm here, I'm ready to go. Whereas other people will panic in this type of market and be a little bit uncertain. This particular example was a duplex site that was purchased, and duplex site is basically a site that can be knocked down and you can put 2 subdivided residences with a common wall on it. It's a really large block of land in terms of the size, 1,038 square meters. To put that in perspective, the minimum size in this particular area for a duplex site was 550 square meters. So this block, in the scheme of it, not only could you put the duplexes on there, but there is a potential to put some further secondary dwellings on the back of each one, potentially putting you with 4 residences if you were to bring the project to fruition. The challenges that were encountered on this particular block, and if you're ever exploring this type of strategy, it's not purely around the frontage of the property or the land size. The stormwater engineering component, in terms of where does the stormwater feed into, becomes a very, very important part of the proposition. Because if you're unable to satisfy council as to where the water is going to flow and that it can follow gravity, or that there's an alternate method that is allowable, then it doesn't matter if it meets all the other criteria. It's not a block that can ever be developed. Now, obviously, we've had a fairly significant boom post-COVID in Sydney, and even, I suppose, slightly before that, probably from mid-2019. This property now sits in value in the range of about $2.3 to $2.5 million, and I've put that little bit of a buffer in there on the basis of, you know, where we are in the market at the moment. Now, whilst that area has performed exceptionally well, and this relates to the Sutherland Shire in Sydney, it hasn't performed that well. It's the fact that this property, undeveloped, we haven't touched it, haven't done anything to it. The fact that it had options, the fact that there is a very strong feasibility for what the end value of the development would be, has led to this property growing exceptionally well in a very short period of time. So what we say to our clients, and we'll look at some buy and hold strategies, some other active strategies as we call them, the more options that you have with a property, the more that you can influence its capital growth, the greater the overall market growth will also be on that particular option.
Thank you, Tal. So Brisbane, I'm assuming if anyone's got questions, they'll just put their hand up. Yep. Oh, really? Okay, cool. Yep.
Was that $2.5 million after they redeveloped to the duplex?
I haven't done anything. They've just left it. They've just left it as is. So a lot of times these properties, we're just doing some cosmetic stuff to clean them up, because the best properties are generally the ones that they're not that tenantable straight away. And as we said, our clients aren't developers. Professional developers don't need us. Their clients are just looking to say, how do we have more control over the gains on the property instead of it being passive? How can we tweak potentially the value of the asset in the long term? So I'm just mindful of time, so I'm probably taking too much time at the front end of this presentation. So I'll just jump into a few case studies here around kind of Brisbane, and this has been the big change with Queensland. I mean, the yellow line is Queensland's population growth and state migration. So sucking a lot of people out of Melbourne and Sydney, and that's actually been bringing a lot of money into the region. So central Brisbane, central Gold Coast, central Sunshine Coast, and those markets were already doing really well pre-COVID. This wasn't getting more. It's the same as with a lot of the regional centres around Vic, New South. They were already growing. It was just that COVID really came in and exacerbated that. So it really accelerated what was already happening. Brisbane strategies like Melbourne, it's a decentralisation into these mini activity centres instead of major cities. So naturally, you've got the Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, which are major cities, but then they've got these mini activity centres, being Chermside, you've got Mount Gravatt, Carindale, and Indooroopilly. So investing around these nodes is where you can tap into major infrastructure investment and generally find a price point that's affordable for a lot. So Brisbane market's been really fascinating to watch because it's surged significantly. The middle ring, some of these middle ring areas have gone from 600K price points to 900s. But there's still some pockets that we think are really good opportunities, like Ferny Grove up here, which actually sits on the border, really high incomes, really high percentage of owner occupiers, and great school catchment. and there's a lot of investment happening in the region there. So I'll keep it somewhat brief. Similar types of strategies to what Tel talked about is available in Brisbane. The planning scheme's a little bit more complex. So the good thing is Brisbane City Council looks after everything inside about 15 k's, which is great. Go to Melbourne, there's probably 30 or 40 councils inside 10 k's. So Brisbane's more uniform, which is terrific, but a little bit more complex. Like this is what's an LDR site, low density residential. You can't subdivide that normally inside 200 metres of a commercial precinct. You can. So there's some complexities here that a lot of other buyers don't know about. Can be some good opportunities on these. You can raise them and renovate them, knock down, rebuild. So you want to look for properties that are post-war, pre-war is protected, and they're really, really protected for their property out there, which is understanding. So these types of strategies can be really powerful. Still sub 1 mil strategies. In some cases, you can pick them up even less than that. And that's Banyo, which is about 15 k's out of town. Lower price point, there's the Moreton Bay Council, which is just outside Brisbane City Council. And this is a similar strategy in a sense that this was only bought a few weeks ago. There's no way the client's going to do anything with this because the build costs are too high. You wouldn't get the townhouse sales anyway. But this site is what's called next generation zoning. And it's been earmarked for higher density. It's even better again. But right now you can buy there for about, that was a pretty good buy, probably early sevens. And I was drawing that. And you can see here, it's basically, it's right near the train station, right near the infrastructure hub. So essentially with these types of assets, you need to do a bit of work to them. They're a little bit unloved. So we always say 5 to 10k budget. Sometimes the construction's a little bit average as well. So you've got to be really careful what you're acquiring. But the yields are still decent on these. And this is a low price point, good cash flow strategy that we're putting forward for clients that still want to receive some growth. Should we wrap up there or should I do a really quick? Yeah, really quick on Melbourne. I haven't put any notes in on Melbourne. Melbourne's a really interesting marketplace because this is what's happened. The population decline has been something that was unexpected. Melbourne's all about decentralised city into these mini activity centres. What's also happening is a decentralisation into these major regional hubs as well. A lot of opportunity in the regional centres of Bendigo and Ballarat. You're talking 5 to 700k investments. Buy as central as possible and don't touch new property. But you can see also here too, there's a lot of growth to happen. The shaded areas where they're expecting there to be significant residential development growth. A lot of major infrastructure projects, big hospitals, big tunnels, everything happening in the Western Corridor. So when we go to presentations on infrastructure, Melbourne's talking about we need to build the West. We need to build the West. And you can see why. The Southeast is just densely populated. 60% of people live out here, work out here. It's like a mini city, because they really need to get the West humming and more connected to the CBD, which is happening. So the last thing I'll show you is just around a couple of key areas to watch. West Footscray, there's a $1.5 billion hospital going in there. You're basically 6 k's out of the city. And these are the types of like small character homes on 300, 400 square metres, circa 1 mil. We use a traffic light system to look at risk indicators and growth indicators across different suburbs. And I'll share the presentation with Bob, who can share with the room. And you've got areas like Sunshine West Activity Centre, 12, 14 k's from the city. This was bought, I think, last week for about $850. This has subdivision potential, plus it's just a good quality home close to infrastructure. So I think sometimes you look at these major capital cities and think they're a bit unaffordable. We still feel there's good opportunity in these areas. This market's only moved 10% in the last 2 years. So when you look at the market, people say, oh, it's gone up so much, it could come back. We see these as actually a safer bet since they haven't gone that much. And a lot of what's going to drive them is 5 to 10 years. So it's not immediate influences. So purely because of time, I'll wrap it up there. I'm hoping that was on point and helpful to people. I mean, once again, we're here to make sure that the decisions you make are more informed and you can make sense of all the outside noise. I'm sure the media is going to hammer the property market in the months to come. And if you do invest, I hope you do it safely and well. And if you need any help, we're more than happy to guide you. Just reach out to us. Thank you. Thank you, everyone at home as well.
Anybody have any questions for Julian or Carl, and particular market, particular strategy that sounds interesting to you? And I find quite, I agree with what the philosophical side of it. Everything you do, you've got to have a philosophy. It's a principle of what you believe, and followed by methodology. And you pay the dividends to do the work. And it's not a random. Some of us do get lucky, but if you want a predictable outcome, you've got to follow a set of methodology. So I really like the what you're saying there. Anybody have any questions before we close this off?
More than welcome to reach out direct to. I know sometimes it's a personal situation, moving questions, so you might want to give us a call or drop us an email. That's fine as well. I'm happy to give our time to you. Me too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Put the hands
very
to.
much.
Thank you. Some inside.
We're welcome.
Excellent.
Happy to be here.
Great.
We're not kicking you out, so if you'd like to stay and have a drink, chat to either any of the accountants or Bob, our financial planner, or just meet some new friends, like-minded, interested in property, etc. Still plenty of nibbles on the table, still a few bottles of wine, so don't rush out the door if you don't need to. Thank you. Get anyone a top up? Another beer or anything?
Yes, I think it's like here. Okay. So I've
Was yours Stella?
yes, thank you.
That's right. And please do complete the evaluation forms for us. Thank you.
Sorry, there's not much there.
That's all right.
So if you want to catch up with do you pay for a meeting?
Depends, but yes. Yes. Depends what you know what you're after.
I had a problem.
Sometimes we charge 660 for an insurance, depending on if you're after some sort of general advice, then we can give that to you. If it's just a meet and greet, that can be complimentary, and then if it works, no, 660 if you want a general advice in meeting, not personal advice. If it's just a meet and greet, so you want to go ahead with a whole statement of advice, personal advice, then the initial meeting is included in part of the fees and social advice. Yeah.
No, but this is like a.
It's just that we get some people who sort of want to hear more returns. We just have to have general factual information. And that's all they need to know.
So they say
But if you want
thank you.
are you at DFK? Yeah.
You got it. All right. Oh, you're doing this, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very rich. Yeah,
That
that's
would
good.
be all right.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
I started doing like accessibility
Yeah, got a
Yeah.
months ago, but yeah, trying to wrap my head around it.
so
Yeah, yeah.
you're all good.
Right. If you'd like a second opinion, I can
Yeah.
No, well, thanks.
So it's
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 All right, good.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
See you.
So it's no problem.
But other funds, so they're like, you know,
Have friends. So all you guys do.
Oh, yeah,
to
yeah.
Slide
So I was
that.
going to put them through.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, it's just like, see you later.
Bye-bye.
I'll see you.
Yeah.
It didn't matter.
They're very, I mean, they're just stockbrokers,
This is
so they don't consider the bigger picture strategy, whereas we're looking at application and what your big picture is, in terms of what you need when inside a super, outside a super, trying to get the balance right.
I mean, if I can do the second.
And when you say most medical, you mean like medical people buying
Yep, I'll get into those.
houses?
Let's
So families live in or buying?
Now, he's a fraction busy, so we're in the panic to lead up to the 30th of June, and then he's on holidays
I'm
for
not
2
in
days.
CCR.
That's all right. I'd wait till-
Yeah,
It's not yet.
So do Do clients, do they go through Bob to get something, or do you?
You can go direct.
So it's really nice.
Yep.
I like
Yeah, yeah,
Wise Eight, because I try to buy a house.
Yeah, so it's very good. Yeah, good, thanks. That was good.
Little one.
Yeah, likewise with your guys.
See you around. I'll try Queensland. And I was just going on. Seems like online, but I don't really have like an idea of stuff in Queensland.
That's why a lot of the stuff. Like I didn't actually get to it, but like some of the stuff.
And then I tried to develop skills at seminar main way. Some are really solid. I just got through that. So then I just used Wise Eight and English shooting classes. Yeah, yeah, we've got one.
That's all right, you're very welcome. Is this time okay for a professional or would breakfast on?
Yeah, I just,
I actually don't mind, this is fine.
I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, they've got something that's pretty good guys.
I think, I'm in.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, they'll use some stuff front, nice, skills, everything. Saying I don't really like sunset. Not really need it.
It's quite a if you want to go for that.
Yeah, heaps of like gold on.
In Canberra, it's a great one. Yeah. So your yield.
I've never lived in Newcastle, but that's pretty hard. Just got to trust these guys, you know. Yeah, they gave me like a bit like a rundown of it, identify a little bit, and you know, to buy and hold. Yeah, it was 10 in the first week. Yeah, started with four bedroom. Yeah,
Thank you so much for coming. That was all right.
You've been in
You've done your
That was good fun. It was good.
You've got to invest in initial
Ready to jump
money to get the research. Yeah, so everything I do for myself, for the client, it's all up.
I don't know. I'm trying to always sort of torn conservative where buy and hold blue chip as they say, like it's a proper grade or
Yeah, that's trying to.
I really like the idea of owning like
You're okay?
I know it's not fancy, but I like the idea of owning 4 or 6 units. But in regional towns, that's a lot to grow.
All right, lovely. You've got any queries or?
Definitely.
Attached to it. Rid of it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's already, we have house lease, so there's already equity. It's already paid, so just
From this thing.
find good strategy. So I think at the moment, I've got one blue chip now, so going to the cheap blocks of 4 or 6 in the regional.
Well, if you're after.
I don't know, but long term, probably the A grade. It's way better off.
And it's, I think, reasonable clients have done it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand that. I'm in Downs, I've been doing it for 20 years, and I sort of haven't still forever. So I thought I'd have it. We have a company. We've got 4 clinics here in Canberra, but I thought if I subscribed away,
Excellent. Bye-bye. Leave your dates on the front.
Yeah.
All right, well, okay, no problem.
Yeah, thanks for pay by owner. 10 units or 20 units or whatever the.
That's good.
You happy with the president?
Yeah.
Yes.
You're very, very welcome.
About like. Yeah. That's always good too.
But because I reached out to them last time, so I had CEO reach. But because I mean, with COVID and everything, we had to actually. This is what we could be quite influential. Just the message out there.
I haven't actually done work, but I just see myself at point end and stuff. That what the process is.
They're just not.
Okay, yeah, just saying.
The units where it goes.
I don't know why. South now.
So
Well, I think it's the market.
That was good to learn, but Like,
And it happens so quickly, right? So there's no,
yeah, like everyone.
Yes,
always
no,
started earlier.
so he just
started at 20.
That's it. And he
But my friends were 50.
Okay.
Like,
tell
sweet
me
man.
where should
I'm starting at 50.
Okay, how are your first runs?
Yeah.
Done your evaluation form?
So,
I haven't.
I'll
Why
find
did
it
run
come
for that?
So I got the cash. So I got $1 million cash. So it's crazy.
Yeah. But that's what happens, right? When things are, everyone's optimistic, strategy goes like that. No.
Yes, and like you said, when the market's a bit warm, start paying still a lot of fear and out and stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Have you found a lot of, I heard, like, because of COVID, all the people within a 1-bedroom apartment wanted a 2-bedroom apartment so that they could work from home, and anyone with 2 bedrooms wanted 3 bedrooms, and you know, family started wanting one rooms and the like. So has that, you talked about so the lack of population growth, I guess, is kids would move out of home because they don't want to be
Because of the company developing
That's expansion that seemed to sort of go It seemed to be the fact that people went from the share house to 3. We went and spoke to the same moving out from 5. Yeah, it's very fascinating. And then some people even just selling out, investing into strategies in coastal, regional. A lot of clients are like, oh, sold in Newcastle, and we're just renting for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was really interesting to see as well. So they soaked up a lot of record. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. You'd love to be able to heat map it.
Yeah.
what it comes with.
Yeah, we need another census or something.
No one expected that. That's dropping. Yeah, everyone then just became like, oh, the stimulus will fix everything. So there's still less people.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the moving interest rates does.
That's amazing.
Prices and stuff. It doesn't seem to be slowing.
Up here. We've had 3 months compared. It's kind of much if you could. You Canberra born and bred?
No, but I've been here since so close enough. Yeah, no, we've got an interesting bubble here. So.
Yeah. Just wanted to ask.
I got sent to sleep, so just check it out. It was pretty cool.
And I think here, like our average
But
property
I
prices
was
are
just
higher.
chatting to Michael and I'm interested in doing a course about developing. And just want to say, is this something that you guys advise on, like sites in Canberra and help with the rules around that, or is it not something that's sort of in your alley?
We don't do it, but I think that you should, like, if you buy a property,
Yeah,
that's
because hyper expectations.
have a development potential. It's a reason that property comes from 1 to 3,
Yeah.
2.5.
Yeah,
So
In
that's
Canberra, I think most people buy property, they don't think that fast.
yeah.
So
I
I
sold the
think
company
as a consultant, I think we will probably do it.
November.
Yeah, that's what I'm just looking for.
Yeah, that was
I've got
a
2
classic
houses
case
at
of
the moment, but yeah, I think I want to start looking to how to get more value out of them and whether it's divide and knock down or whatever, but I don't want to go grand scale like 12 townhouses. No one to sort of start
That's
low.
where you are when you're selling.
But it's like,
It's painful when that happens.
Yeah.
You're trying to
But
buy
yeah,
it.
There's a lot of information when I
well,
don't
sorry,
have
didn't go to
anyone,
auction
in my circle doing it.
Okay, so what's your,
whatever the cost they wanted.
I work in Canberra Dental Procedures, so we have a couple of dental
Yeah, that
clinics
was,
here.
yeah. we were like,
oh, okay.
So yeah, I've been a
this
dental
house
game
that
for
we trashed.
Are you dentist?
We
dental
were
procedures,
going to spend
so
money renovating.
quite-
Oh, making the,
it's dentures.
So by the time
Yeah,
I
just
went
off
to
the so
I see.
yeah, we got
renovated.
4 locations
So
here.
it's like, all right, well,
Going
if you want to
quite
pay
well,
some,
but-
no,
No, I don't want to do it for another 20
How's
years.
a tenancy
Okay.
actually? If you
I
got
wanna know, I
a
can
tenant, there's a
just,
tenant that trusts you?
Back
so you got to set up your strategy.
It was just trash.
Okay.
Family.
Yeah, I was just saying,
Going
Mike, I think my
as
end
well.
game is I want to
Like
start
if
buying
you-
lots of
If someone's been
cheap
here probably more than 12
four,
months.
four or 6 flats, units in like Wagga and Albridge regional.
That's for a small
You can
property.
get them for like 600,000-700,000 and they cash flow like
And one of the
40,000
houses
or whatever. But
cops of rates.
Yeah.
5 or 6
And you still can't get them out.
yeah, yeah,
And our team have gone to be
yeah,
3 times to get them
Yeah.
out. And I only just got out on the most recent one because there was a VCAT center and people
Yeah.
were there when the cops raided can't ever come back. and one of them was in the house. So they broke the wall through that.
So what I was saying,
What I was thinking, like sort of recap put in place, so now they're out. I could not believe how many times they had to go to court essentially to try to get around that and give them more chances, real chances.
Okay.
Like
So
footage,
yeah, just
the
using
neighbour's got
the
video footage of the camera.
fireplace here, develop it, sell it,
Rain
and then
in
use
the
that.
house. And we're like, well, surely,
Yeah,
no, it's amazing. And any more than a year, they're really trying to protect the tenants so they've got somewhere to live. And every other state, we're seeing it's a lot more balanced. Interesting. It's a wonderful
In
site.
Canberra, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
No worries, nice to
The,
meet you.
Again, yeah, the feedback's great.
Too back to good in, yeah, always
So,
thank you.
I think
Pretty much the whole Canberra.
we
and part
put
of
the recording
Sydney
up
is
on
also
our
is mostly like a half of
website.
Okay,
So
that's
people can watch
really
it
to do
later
with
for those who didn't turn up on time.
British system where
Oh,
the crime zones,
yeah.
crimes name. So when you order it,